Greetings, I'm Dack Rouleau.
I'm Christy Dopf.
And this is the Overwritten Book Club. This is the second episode of the book club where we are reading Machiavelli's The Prince, one of the most recognizable classics of political philosophy. And tonight we are going to be reviewing chapters 5 through 8. We are going to be talking about some of the strategies that Machiavelli detailed in this section. So, Christy, as my voice continues to fail me, you can probably lead us off, as our cats have a bit of a Machiavellian conflict in the background.
Yes. Okay. So we went through the first 4 chapters, and we're kind of building on this book. And so I guess the best way is just to kind of keep going from where we left off. So in chapter 5, we're really talking about these new lands that a prince acquires and how to hold on to them. And throughout this series of chapters we read for this episode, we kind of start to get into some specific examples of princes or rulers that Machiavelli appreciates. I think maybe would be a good word. I don't think he has nailed down anybody to be the perfect prince, but we get pretty close.
Yes, he gives some examples throughout history. He cites Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. He describes these as men who had fortune come to them from opportunity, but who also had prowess to take advantage of that opportunity. And as we said last week, as Machiavelli talks about the role of a proper prince, meaning the proper head of state, he isn't approaching the problem in the moralizing way that we do nowadays, where our focus is on equity for everyone and equal representation and things like that. He's approaching the problem from how a prince, meaning a sovereign head of state, should maintain rule within his country when he's constantly facing threats from invasions by foreign adversaries.
Right.
And it's interesting to see this vision of a world that, in a way, you could say the world back then was much less stable than it might be today. It's interesting how, even though they didn't have the threat of nuclear annihilation and things like that, there was a lot less internal stability, I suppose.
Right. And that's something I've gotten from just the footnotes of the examples he's used, is how quickly lands were taken over and lost within a series of less than a decade, honestly, in some of these cases. So things were very unstable. He talks specifically, like, there's 3 main ways that somebody can hold on to their land. And we kind of discussed these a little bit in the first episode, but one's devastating them. 2 is going there and living in person. And 3 is letting them keep their own laws and setting up an oligarchy.
Yeah, it's interesting. The definition of oligarchy that's used in this book is a little bit different from the way we use it today.
Yeah.
Machiavelli defines an oligarchy more or less as a government established to control the population of a conquered country on behalf of another authority. So it's this understanding that this oligarchical government is put into power specifically to pacify and control the population on behalf of some other force that is really the one in power. That's different from the way we use it nowadays. We use oligarchy, I think, basically as a synonym for elitism or something like that. And there is definitely that authoritarian element to modern oligarchy, but it's not exactly in the way that Machiavelli meant for the term to be used.
No. And so like we mentioned in these first couple of chapters here, he does go through some specific examples. He talks a lot about how each of these men
that's Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus.
Yeah, they each have an interesting opportunity that becomes present to them. It's not something that they are directly forcing, but they're taking advantage of it, and had their prowess not been so keen, they would not be able to seize upon that opportunity, and they would not have enjoyed this great prosperity then for their people.
Right. So let's take a look at this quote he has. I'm actually just going to let you read the quote because my voice is completely useless.
All right. It should be borne in mind that there is nothing more difficult to handle, more doubtful of success, and more dangerous to carry through than initiating changes in a state's constitution. The innovator makes enemies of all those who prospered under the old order, and only lukewarm support is forthcoming from those who would prosper under the new. Their support is lukewarm partly from fear of their adversaries who have the existing laws on their side, and partly because men are generally incredulous, never really trusting new things unless they have tested them by experience.
So what he's talking about there is once you, the prince, have conquered a foreign country, you now have to have that foreign population kept under control, because you're not just wiping out the entire population. You're going and you're trying to more or less rule them as a territory.
Right.
And what he talks about is how when you're changing that conquered territory's constitution and laws and customs, you're going to have some serious pushback from the native population. The example that comes to my mind is as the COVID authoritarians have taken over the United States of America, we have seen people rebel because people have said, hey, I was accustomed to being able to go to the grocery store without having to show my allegiance to this COVID system. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we do in many ways resemble a conquered nation at this point in time.
Right. Yeah. We're experiencing that right now in the school systems in Iowa. Mm. There's a back and forth on mandating masks, and many parents, us included, are very upset that this has come back down and children are being forced to wear masks again when they are, I would say, probably the part of the population that is least affected by it. So, yeah, we're definitely experiencing that right now.
And it says here that you can expect only lukewarm support forthcoming from those who would prosper under the new order. Their support is lukewarm partly from fear of their adversaries who have the existing laws on their side, and partly because men are generally incredulous, never really trusting new things unless they have tested them by experience. So yeah, there is this idea of tradition that is on the side of people who don't like this invasion, as it were. Mm-hmm. There are obviously other examples unrelated to COVID, but that was just, as we feel like we're losing control of our own country, it's interesting to read this book, which does not exactly advocate for a government ruled by the people.
Right.
So we can go to the second quote, which looks like it goes just for those three sentences there.
The populace is by nature fickle. It is easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to confirm them in that persuasion. Therefore, one must urgently arrange matters so that they are no longer believed that they can be made to believe by force.
Oh, so that when they no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force. Well, what does that remind you of? Anything like modern?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of exactly what we were talking about, that we're having to be made to believe that we're being forced to do these things when we actually do still have a choice.
Right. We do maintain autonomy. But you can see that the idea that it's easy to persuade people of something but difficult to confirm them in that persuasion. You can get people to try something new, but to try to get them to adopt it as a new permanent way of life is very difficult. That's happened with the mask mandates and everything else, that, and the restrictions was when it first came about, there was almost a sense of exhilaration with it, where it was like, oh, this is an interesting new thing. But now that it's been going on for almost 2 years, people are getting fed up. They're saying, what is the result of all of this? It's difficult to train them to accept this as a normal way of life.
Right. And I think the tool that they used in this for us was fear.
Yes.
And making people afraid. I think I do, not to go too far off the trail with the mask, I do think there is a sense of our generation wants to have something big that they're fighting against. Yeah. And I noticed that with masks, like people were making them at home, and because there was a mask shortage initially. And so there is this sense that if there's enough fear and there's enough, you can all band together and fight this one thing, in this case it's COVID, everybody wants to jump on that, and that's what they did. But now, like you said, we're starting to, thankfully, even though we have a very short-term memory in our culture, we are starting to remember that things aren't and haven't always been this way and don't need to stay this way.
Although we should remember the Machiavellian warning that when people no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force. Mm-hmm. So Machiavelli spends, to get a little bit away from COVID, Machiavelli spends quite a bit of these chapters that we're discussing tonight. He spends quite a bit of them praising the rule of Cesare Borgia. Mm-hmm. He talks about him at some length, and there's an interesting quote right here that we will read.
So this kind of is partial quote, but the main part I wanted to focus on was because I know no better precepts to give a new prince than ones derived from Sigeret's actions. And if what he instituted was of no avail, this was not his fault, but arose from the extraordinary and inordinate malice of fortune. Just to pause a moment, this is chapter 7, and I really kind of took this chapter and went off into another realm of researching the Borgias again.
You said that you had been interested in that TV series, The Borgias.
Yeah, so that was from like 2011 to 2013. I really enjoyed that show. It was a well-made show, but the history was incredibly interesting. And so I found The Prince interesting on that level because it's reliving some of this historical actions and what was going on at this time. So something I thought of here, just as we kind of get into talking about Sigeret's actions and how Machiavelli takes the time to go over them, will Machiavelli ultimately, throughout this book, come to the summary that Sigeret is the best, most ideal prince? Because right now in this chapter, it seems like he's starting to point towards, this is the best example I can give anybody, and because he wasn't ultimately successful, wasn't completely his fault.
Right. Well, that's what he means by the malice of fortune. He implies that Sigeret Borgia could have had a much better reign if it wasn't for the inordinate malice of fortune, if misfortune hadn't befallen him so significantly. This is something that Machiavelli talks about, is the problem of fortune and fate. He says that a leader's he says that a leader's success is not necessarily always contingent on that leader's ability. Sometimes it's just a matter of fate. To use a recent example, I think that this might, you could say that this applies to Trump in certain ways, where he may not have been a particularly skilled leader, but because the country was in an interesting state of flux, at least culturally, Trump was able to emerge as a more memorable figure than he may have otherwise.
Right. Just reading some things about this Borgia Duke. He was considered like there was a nickname, the Dark Lord of Rome, and he was considered like this rock star, and he, was taking over all of these areas because his father was Pope Alexander. His father did have control of the church and thus was backing all of these actions and really was building up the church's power. Ultimately, it didn't end up coming into his favor when a new pope was designated, but Machiavelli does give him that kind of pass as that was, fortune did misfall him eventually.
So I don't know as much about Sigeret Borgia as I probably should, but from what I understand, he was looked at as one of the great military leaders before Napoleon, like in the way that Napoleon sort of became just that byword for a great military leader. Borgia had that similar title for quite some time.
Yeah, I had another quote saved. It's rather long, but I'll just kind of summarize it, that Machiavelli does go into extensive detail. He cannot find more recent examples than those set by the Duke, Sigeret Borgia. It's necessary to secure himself against enemies when friends conquer either by force or strategy. He made himself both loved and feared by subjects, followed and respected by soldiers. I mean, at this point in the book, I think Machiavelli is checking off all the boxes here for him. So this is a very interesting case study, I think.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is he talks about how the leader must be both loved and feared by his subjects. This is a kind of dark psychology that I think people in modern political discourse don't like to get into. The idea that we like to think of when we're looking for a president, we're just thinking who has the right morals, who has the right position on the issues. We don't like to think about leadership in terms of the charismatic nature of it. I mean, I just did a video the other day sort of dissing charisma in American politics, but there is that element of the leadership ability that I think we don't talk about. Like, I like to think that I'm pretty well informed about certain things, but I recognize that I wouldn't be a great leader because I'm not very good at connecting with people. Machiavelli here says that Borgia was not only great militarily, but also was great in knowing how to really manipulate people.
Right. Yeah, that was the word I thought about too. He was a really good manipulator, both just in the common people and then his, upper class friends and enemies. He was very strategic about when he did marry. He was strategic about whose partnership he was using. Of course, all of these families are going to be strategic in their moves, but for whatever reason, Caesar knew how to do this well.
So one of the other dark sides of political administration, which we don't like to acknowledge in our own political discourse, is that of how to control a population with aggression. And Machiavelli has an interesting description of how Cesare Borgia was able to solve that problem when he faced a conquered territory. So
So Borgia found that the territory he conquered had previously been ruled by weak overlords, quickly to despoil their subjects than to govern them well. They had given them cause for anarchy rather than union, to such an extent that the province was rife with
brigandage.
Thank you. Factions and every sort of abuse. He decided, therefore, that it needed good government to pacify it and make it obedient to the sovereign authority. Borgia then places a stern administrator in power who turns up murdered at a later date, thereby appeasing the public.
Right, so Cesare Borgia put into control an abusive political leader who obviously did not generate goodwill among the population, and then that leader was quite conveniently murdered, presumably on Borgia's orders, and then that gave the population a sense of euphoria. What I'm told, we saw some of this in the election of 2020. There were the people who really, really, really hated Trump. And so when he lost, there was a sense of euphoria, not for everybody, but for those who hated him, a sense of catharsis. I'm told that this is how people felt, or some people felt, after Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. There was a sense of euphoria. I heard that was part of the reason for the popularity of the movie Jaws, which came out the year after Nixon's resignation. People saw the killing of the shark as the defeat of the bloated, corrupt Nixon. And so this idea that you're going to indulge the population's darker, more savage tendencies in order to accomplish your own political goals, that's another level of manipulation that we don't like to think of as something that we could endorse in our supposedly more morally elevated time.
Right. And Borgia was rumored to have perhaps plotted or killed himself many of his opponents, and sort of used this as a manipulation tool. While we don't see this now in our political atmosphere, we are seeing, I think people used as patsies to build up and tear down each other. So while we're not seeing outright murders, we're seeing destruction of careers and people who come on the scene just for some sort of manipulation tactic.
Well, I'm pretty sure that's what a lot of the Me Too stuff has been about, taking down a lot of these Hollywood performers so that we're focused more on the popular culture instead of what our political leaders are doing. We talked a little bit off camera, not so much on camera, about Andrew Cuomo, where we are not convinced at all that he was taken down purely because he was sexually harassing some of his staffers.
Right.
We both came to the conclusion that there was something more going on behind the scenes, that he must have really trespassed upon someone very high up in power. And so he becomes a bit of a patsy where the public gets to have this collective lynch mob, I guess.
Yeah. Which is interesting with him specifically because there was such an infatuation from the public and how quickly they turned on him too.
So that, for some reason, reminds me of one of the subjects that Machiavelli talks about in these sections. He talks about people who become heads of state through crime. He talks about people who basically kill their way to the top or who use some other form of manipulation to get there. And I don't know that we necessarily have that in this political culture. I don't know that's exactly the same way as it was in House of Cards. But there is the idea of purchasing your political power in a way that Trump may have, or in the case of Michael Bloomberg when he was trying to run for president.
Right.
The idea, so this idea that you become the head of a state by some criminal or nefarious method, Machiavelli doesn't denounce that necessarily.
Yeah. So he says, violence must be inflicted once for all. People will then forget what it tastes like, so be less resentful. And above all, a prince must live with his subjects in such a way that no development, either favorable or adverse, makes him vary his conduct.
Right, because when you start to change your position, that's when people see you as a weak leader. They see you as a turncoat, and they begin to think, they question your own ideology. They question whether you actually know what you're doing.
Right.
But yeah, it is interesting how he says that just because you're a criminal and a scoundrel and you get to the top of government through crime, that doesn't mean you're going to be a bad leader once you get there. It just means you have to be more careful.
Right. And that violence must be inflicted once and for all. That was just like a really standout thing to me, that it was just like it's a necessary evil, and if you're gonna do it, you got to do it right and all at once, or else there's going to be questions asked. People are going to start questioning what kind of a leader you are, and
right, they start dragging it out.
I
think that in a way there's a lot of, not necessarily the violent element, but in our government, there's obviously a huge reluctance to face responsibilities for things that need to be taken care of. The ongoing student loan crisis, the healthcare crisis, everything else. These politicians are just kicking the can down the road, and that what they're doing is, instead of just handling it once and for all, they are prolonging the suffering because they don't want to take responsibility.
Right.
So the question is, would Machiavelli see any American president of recent memory as being a good leader?
I don't think so.
No, I can't think of any reason why he would. He would see them as cowardly, I would think.
Yeah, and I would say he would see them as somebody who's not really in control, because they are not the ones making the decision, and the allegiance and authority is not at the peak or at the president.
Well, he said specifically he wasn't going to be talking about republics, but I think he would probably describe this system of government as more of a bureaucracy than a republic, or even an oligarchy. If America is an oligarchy, and then that raises the question, who it holds the real power? It must be someone somewhere else.
Right.
Interesting questions. So that will conclude the second episode of the Overwritten Book Club. We've been reading Machiavelli's The Prince. We have now finished chapter 8, and we are going to read 6 more chapters. So we are going to get to chapter 14, and that will be, we'll be reading chapters 9 through 14 before we get to the third episode of the Overwritten Book Club, which will come out next week. I don't remember what day of the week it's actually going to be, but it's going to be in October, and we will discuss more of Machiavelli, the Prince, and all these other things. Read this book, if for no other reason than it will enhance your enjoyment of the show The Borgias. So before my voice gives out, I'll just say thank you very much, and good night.
Good night.